I mean, there are rules I need to follow.
They have the kid.
I've made no secret of the fact that I haven't made it a priority to watch The Mandalorian because of its attachment to Disney+. I've also said 100 times that I don't have a problem with the show. I haven't seen it, so I'm not going to judge it. The 2 episodes I watched, because Tim showed them to me, were just fine. Nothing terrible, yet nothing terribly memorable, which in today's current Star Wars climate is all it takes to be a success, sadly. When Hasbro decided to sideline the anticipated Return of the Jedi Retro Collection in favor of a retro collection of figures based on The Mandalorian, I was rather baffled. The Mandalorian already had a black series of figures, a carbonized redeco of those same figures, and a vintage collection run of the characters. No one was asking for these. Because they were in the Kenner style, these were the only versions of the figures I decided to concern myself with. In typical Hasbro fashion, they were really tough to track down and didn't come anywhere close to meeting demand. But that's no surprise at this point. The figures come in the same flimsy card backs as the previous waves of retro figures, with the same faux weathering that looks as chintzy as it ever did, and Hasbro has done a layup with the photography to make it look something akin to what Kenner might have done. The photography, being modern, is a little too crisp and lacks any film grain that would give off a true Kenner vibe, but I doubt they were going to make such an effort on the card backs anyway. These cards don't even have the rest of the figures photographed on the back. Before I get into the figures themselves, I'm just going to tell you now that I refuse to purchase the Remnant Trooper. And why, you ask? He came in a $50 Monopoly game that's now going for higher prices online. Hasbro took the Kenner Stormtrooper, a figure they'd already remade for the Star Wars Retro Collection, dusted it in some gray-brown spray paint, and threw it into an expensive board game. They knew nobody wanted the 1000th version of Monopoly. They just wanted one of these figures to cost the buyer $50. Putting a Troop Builder figure into a board game is just as mercenary as putting the Tarkin figure in that other game. Buy a Stan Solo Stormtrooper and hit him with some spray paint if you really have to have this figure. Hasbro knows the vast majority of these Monopoly games are heading right into landfills once people remove the Trooper. This is horrendously wasteful predatory marketing, and everyone at Hasbro should be ashamed. I'd argue they should be fined for deliberately creating massive amounts of throwaway bloat just to inflate the price of an action figure. As for the general release figures, I admit I've been intrigued upon seeing them in person because they very much remind me of being a kid and seeing characters in the Kenner line that I had no context for, so my imagination was able to run wild. As someone who hasn't followed the Mandalorian series, I'm coming at these characters with the same point of view as when I saw the figures in stores, like Bosk and 8D8 for the first time. Hasbro checked all the boxes on its list to make these figures Kenner retro. However, in the doing, they've missed one particular mark. Since The Mandalorian is a post-Return of the Jedi series, both in production chronology and in the timeline of the saga, these figures should look more like the 1985 Power of the Force line if we're being honest with ourselves. But alas, they don't. I'm specifically referring to the many vinyl capes used in this retro wave, when cloth capes would have been the norm by this time. Similarly, the face sculpts reflect the simplicity of the original 1978 Kenner run of figures, rather than the slightly more detailed faces of the Jedi-era toys. Admittedly, that's not as big a deal as the lack of cloth capes. So when we look at these figures as retro, they're specifically Kenner retro from the period of 1978 to 1982, because they just are. Well done, Hasbro. All that being said, I really like the majority of these figures. As a person uninitiated into The Mandalorian, my instinct is to make these figures additional denizens of my Star Wars imagination. The Mandalorian himself is a retooling of Boba Fett, which makes sense. The figure is nicely detailed and holds his weapons well. This, as you know, was not the case with the original retro wave. So the correction of these weapons and hands in the Empire and Mandalorian waves is a welcome relief. Again, I'm not wild about the way the cape looks on him, but it isn't a fatal flaw. The vinyl cape works really well on Moff Gideon. And here's a figure that can become a new Imperial crony in the ranks of the Empire. He comes with his pistol and darksaber accessories, and yet he looks so much like the Kenner Vader in design, I do wonder if Hasbro considered making his darksaber one that telescoped out of his arm in the legendary vintage fashion. Don't misunderstand me, I'm glad they went with the Empire-style lightsaber accessory, because it gives the other figures in the line a chance to use it. I'm just saying it would have been an amusing design callback. When I was a kid, I really had a fascination with IG-88. He was one of the earlier figures I collected. What kid didn't love a good droid to add to the roster? So seeing IG-11 is a really neat spin on an old favorite for me. His rusty coloring and altered details remind me of the first time I saw the Death Star droid and R5-D4 figures as a kid. At the time, I thought they were the evil doppelgangers of C-3PO and R2-D2. IG-11 really looks at home in the streets of Mos Eisley. It's evident Hasbro reverse-engineered this figure from an early IG-88 with the solid eyes and a dull gray color, rather than the revised vintage figure which had hollowed eyes and a silver paint job. The Shadows of the Empire version from the 1990s had almost squared-off eyes, so my instincts tell me IG-11 is not a retooling of that retooling. I was also into pairing up figures as a kid to make character duos. It was just how my brain worked. Going back to Death Star Droid and R5-D4, they were a pair to me just like 3PO and R2 were a pair, or Han Solo and Chewbacca. So while I don't know anything about Kuiil, aside from him saying, "I have spoken," when I look at him, I just want to pair him up with IG-11. They're like the Star Wars answer to Rocket and Groot or something. I love the idea of these guys just hanging out in an alley waiting for their mark to come along. Kuiil and IG-11 stand alongside their Kenner counterparts almost seamlessly, though it is a shame that Kuiil seems to have a little bit of that difficulty keeping hold of his blaster. The Cara Dune figure also has a great overall look to her sculpt. While certainly more detailed than the earliest Kenner figures, she fits in well in the Cantina playset, and I can even see her standing on the bridge of a Star Destroyer amongst other bounty hunters getting an assignment from an Imperial commander. With her dual accessories of rifle and pistol, this figure has more than a bit of that undeniable Kenner Star Wars legacy. It's also nice to have another Kenner-style female character aside from Leia that fits into all kinds of figure display scenarios. If there was one figure in this line that would have certainly benefited from a cloth cape, it would be Greef. The vinyl cape does this figure no justice, and given the nice costume underneath, it's a shame he doesn't have the proper cloak to go with it. Otherwise, he's a fine figure and fits in well with other denizens of the galactic underworld. Grogu seems more of a mandate than a usable toy. You're more or less getting a big space pram, a frog, and a tiny Grogu figure. Grogu has a peg hole for use with playsets and vehicles, I expect, though there are none in the retro collection to use with him. However, there is also no foot peg in the space egg for him to take advantage of. So you just have to sit him in there, kind of, and hope for the best. Having a peg in there would have been a nice use for that peg hole, but ultimately it feels like Grogu should have just been packed in with the Mandalorian. The Mandalorian Retro Collection is probably the most interesting of the retro waves thus far, because it brings new characters into the Kenner roster that are compatible with the vintage vehicles and playsets. Thankfully, the retro Remnant Trooper isn't necessary to acquire given the ubiquity of the Kenner-style Stormtroopers available, and Hasbro shouldn't be rewarded for such a scheme anyway. I'm glad I have these figures. They blend nicely into the original Kenner universe, and they're not retreads like the previous Retro Collection waves. It would be cool to see Hasbro lean into this retro line more in the future, and make other characters from the Star Wars universe available in this style. But I'm not gonna hold my breath. Hope you enjoyed that, everybody. If you want to see more videos about the Star Wars Retro Collection, you can watch our review of Wave 1 here. Or you can see our review of Wave 2, the Empire Strikes Back Collection, here. And now I'm gonna go integrate these figures into the vintage Kenner range.